two B-flat majors are just a dream for fingers and agility and flexibility and velocity. I think this is what we call free fantasia, improvisatory style. Quick fingers, simple harmonic progressions, writing like for violin with the bow up and down, marking the eighth notes in the left hand, perhaps sub-phrased, or perhaps just detached, but with impulse of the upbeat. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1. I think it might be a little bit too much if it's slurred, but at least it can be individually impulsed, like a tenuto. Of course, there is a tenth. Combination that appears in the positioning of the two hands together. What is dangerous, difficult, and important to not do is to extend the 30-second rest of the right hand, since it plays only on every second, third, and fourth 32nd of each eighth note. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You see, it plays in my right hand now for the demonstration purpose with inertia. It should be more reactive. If it was together, superimposed with the bass notes, but it's just in a complete flow over from the bass note to the top 10th. So I suggest the practicing in the ascending arpeggio between the two hands, si fa re. And then also the return from the top note to the next down. So the left hand is not pacing only by itself, but it becomes the launcher for the ascending 30 seconds of the arpeggio. And then, well, you don't repeat the top note, so it's good to practice in rhythms. So the purpose of the fast tempo is that you harmonize the gestures of the spread intervals because of the resonance. And even if you put pedal on the piano, then you hear the chordal progression. But the lightness of touch. Now there is no tenuto per se indicated in the second of the 3/32 of the right hand. So the top note is in the notation not equal in value rhythmically to the bass eighth notes. But that's what happens in the combination once you put as a good craftsman all the notes together. And when you don't have arpeggios, you have scales. More like glissando style. You can do finger pedal. But I also think that tempo choice of another point of view would be a little more calm, but more crisp. you're convinced more than me. Though I invite people who wish to try to think of it not just in contradiction to somebody else, by their own will and opinion. The second half of this free fantasia improvisatory style is all about cadenzas. Minor dominant ninth, well, diminished seventh without the root. So it's clear that when you hear in the same tonality the B flat major first partita, B flat major, in the jig of it, and here you have I think that it is more effective when it's fast. Not only because of the harmonic progression for quarter notes instead of eighth notes. That's not right. It's more about... I always find that at some point we search for the elegance and the right tone that is not over exaggerated in super velocity, nor in purposeful unrushed. I think the rattling resonance of playing very fast was even without pedal, the finger pedal that helps, and happens because the fingers don't lift high fast enough. It's difficult to play crisp, articulated, and fast. So you practice the coordination with the two hands, the descending 230 seconds to the next bass note. And then the bass note to the next first 230 seconds. So you can do. So that when it rolls in continuous, you have impulse from the bass to the 10th and then drop to the next bass note. Which is why I don't think that the eighth notes in the left hand should be played legato, let's say pianistically. And for the pedal, I don't believe it at all, because I think that the pedal only smears even if it enhances. And it's not a question of dry or wet or drawn. It's about holding the fingers in the direction where they go. Si, fa, re, fa, la, fa, do, fa, si, fa, re, do, la, fa. So you feel there is a direction flow up and down. So it's like a balancing act. Because ultimately it has to be sparkly, festive, driven, finger joy. In an acoustic with a resonance, even without the pedal on the grand piano, you will hear a little bit of resonance over this, so it will be sort of a finger pedal. In C sharp major, book 1, the prelude. You have this alternation combination between the two hands, which is here. So the two hands become one. Of course, it's more practical to play with one hand, but it's too stretched. All in the right hand, this makes sense. Of course, the two hands have to be one. blend in one. How to obtain this crisp articulation of fast notes is practice hold and poke. The agility of the knuckles of each of the hands, fingers, included the thumb, which is obviously on the side since it's lying down. Though you could rise it a little bit so it becomes a diagonal thumb without too much high wrist, just higher palm support. So you can practice legato, the middle voice, which is not a voice but the middle note, and then staccato together, the tips which are in reality one after the other. I think it's very useful because it gives you the harmonic progression, it gives you the articulation, the air of the 30-second rest. I think in that sense he's achieved probably out of the 48 the most, in the sense of his time period, virtuosic velocity in this one. Oh, of course you have G major in Book 2. When the two hands play in connection to each other, C minor, Book 1 obviously. Either together, either not together. But here you have the two hands combining to play an open 10th arpeggiated display of chords. What a joy. For the Book 2, he goes into a very interesting choice of 12/16 for the meter, which could suggest, because the unity value is the 16th note through the unit of value everywhere. Question of the choice of dressing up the coating of expression. If you have groups of 3/16 notes a beat, which are 4 beats, so you have ti-ya-ta, long, short, very mildly so, not staccato, because that would be, I think, even if it's legato or non-legato or air legato, it has to have a flow with a direction arrival on every 4 bars. 1, second bar, third bar, fourth bar, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 504, 4. So this is clearly organized not in a free fantasia like the B-flat major of Book 1, which is in sort of a recitativo with wild cadenzas, stop and start, free fantasia, toccata in the old term of the usage by Frescobaldi, touching the keyboard, different type of touches, and fast and slow and dotted rhythms, as well as the crisp articulation of the individual notes. And I think that even if I would have rather, for the interpretation choice that I would do for the B-flat major Book 2, I would have liked it to be written in 8th notes for a common bass rhythmic pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4. If it was 12/8. I think seeing all all these 16th notes visually brings us to think, oh, it's fast. If it was notated in 8th notes, probably, which we do in A major, book 2, in 8th notes. But the fugue of G sharp minor, book 2, in equal 16th notes. Or 8th notes rather in this case. C sharp minor, book 2 is 16th notes. So when you see a group of 3, not triplets, but part of a 12-16 ternary, what happens is that you attempted to give them a shape te-ya-ti-ya-ta-ta, with a little bit of lightness because it's off the 16th note rest. The appoggiatura of the 5th on the 2nd only downbeat that you play so far, 2nd of the 4. And when immediately the voice comes out of the melodic line, and then you feel like how they spawn from each other. It's like a branching of the river, and you feel like when you have a note over it, compared to when you have only a held ostinato and there are no 8th notes. I would privilege the equal articulation without subphrase, subarticulation. It to be either a little faster and at the same time more connected in a legato without to be over legato. It's not singing, it's just a flow. Gentle and flowing. Of the Germanic music, which is a little bit less in its interpretation artistic, but more craftsmanship-like. I would like to hear more of what is written. In slightly more conservative tempo, but still flowing. Of course, the attention of the listener is always in a continuous scale between the soprano, the alto, and the bass. But once the first note is played, you arrive on the 10th before you do the scale in the left hand, picking up the imitation. You have... So there's something going on after the scale in the first voice. And something happens to the second voice when the third voice enters. Suspension for 3, and so follow them all, but still light in touch, and a little bit less slow, to taste all this beauty. Here we touch to the most important part of all of that is how do you shape, form, cultivate the good taste for the right tone with the right genre hinted through the instrument that is not written for in this case, the piano, and be alert, acutely alert to the different patterns between the consecutive tones in the arpeggiations, which are more stretched than the step motion. So I think that we need not to take that for granted. For instance, bar 3, he does, for with the under voice in the right hand and the soprano on top, plunging under the alto and re-rising above it. And that is where you don't want, or you should not want, to amalgamate the two in the same pattern, combined. Rather, and if you want to voice rather louder, the bottom than the top. And this way you hear the one in the background, the one in the foreground, you make a choice. Cherish your voicing. And then the little bridge. I think that it is important to detach ourselves from our eyes reading the 16th note as a choice of meter notation by Bach, and hear what we can produce linear, shaped, with very subtle, it's not, well, it is actually, I was going to say, shapings, archings. And necessarily not it gives me seasickness, nor completely flat, as if it were not this flow of, gentle flow of descending scales. So can one do as much subtlety in the voicings, especially the cross relations, played faster? You know what? I think that is so in the touch of the pianist, the capacity to play precise from close up without lifting the fingers, which is more something to do for, not always, but it's fun, it's more motoric, more engine. Here is more flow of three voices who have their imitation intense or contradictory emotions, or then dotted eighths. I think that when he chooses a genre, would it be a two-voice invention, a three-voice part sinfonia style, he chooses the essence of the text and the texture, but it's up to us to bring it alive in a way that we think it's corresponding to what is supposed to be transmitting through it. I think it's not our job to reinvent it, it's our job to understand it in order to blend our technique in our musicianship, the direction of the line with the phrasing of the storytelling, which is even beyond music. It's about pacing, about space, about arrival points, about visibility, lisibility of your readability in English would be the right word, of your approach. And so both fugues in B flat major start with an eighth note rest, and both of them are in 3/4. So perhaps he looked at it, or perhaps he didn't need to. 20 years in between. He was teaching book 1 already by then. Probably his students and his children outgrew book 1. So he decided, let me write a book 2. Well, possibly not so anecdotically, but factually because of his very important engagement in pedagogy. Bach was really a pedagogue through his writing, through his notation, through his everything. And I think that when you hear the eighth note rests in the beginning, that means that in the 3/4, the next downbeat first bar doesn't come but until the second bar. And in book 2, So you could play it legato. Or shape it in book one's subject with a slur of 2, staccato, and do. The leap down of the 6th is a playful moment. And then the ending of the subject, completely legato and soft. So very characteristic, dancey. Or more elegant. And the book 2 has not 8th note and 16th notes, it only has 8th notes, very few quarter notes. The 2x2 with the anticipation of the appoggiatura, and the appoggiatura becoming the next downbeat. It's a chain system, and you want to lift the finger 3/4 of the key in order to be played. Ta ta ha 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 ha. Like in singing, you have the same note but different syllables. You don't want to sound pianistically repeating by staccatoing the second of the 2, which is the anticipation of the next one. So mi mi re do do mi mi re re do do fa fa. He could have written he didn't, because the first half of 2 bars of this subject is a dropping scale, and then the next 2 bars is just rising to the dominant. Well, oops for the A flat. The anticipation of the E flat after the long held F3 bars and inside the 8th notes by 2. With exchange of voices. It's so luminous, it's so peaceful. It has to be a legato of connected more than sung, and flowing, I think, in a dynamic range that in this case fits to be mezzo piano. If not, there is always the option of the toccata with a forte. I'm sorry, I can't be convincing. I mean, I'm so unconvinced, but trying my best to find a coherence to a different point of view completely compared to the book 1 subject. I think it's more elegant. And these repeated notes, we already had that in G minor book 2. And here, what does it teach us? That we notice communalities? Yes. That there is a toolbox that he uses? Yes. With facts that give us the opportunity to have broken thirds, repeated notes, anticipations, suspensions, appoggiaturas, or the opposite. In other words, yes, we find common tools in his usage for this piece, and this other piece, and that other piece, and some more reminiscent than others. But once you have all of them in your mind, they live with you like a family of good friends. with their individual characteristics, then you revisit them and say, oh, how didn't you? He didn't change at all. Since I started as a child playing, studying, writing, competing with myself by what she asked Mademoiselle Boulanger me to do, to copy them by hand. So I was competing with the score itself. Before I could play it, it was just on table, first approach, or sung with solfège. Do, si, la, si, fa, re, si, si, mi, re, do, do. And even now, 40 years, 50 years later, I still find that they reveal themselves in a different light when you gaze at them again, when you put your ear to connect their harmonic progressions, their voice leadings, expressions, and playfulness, the chromaticism, the leaps, and the structural group of bars. It's very important because I think at this point, now that you explore many of them, if you have started from the beginning or from the end or in this order, it doesn't have to be that you have to practice them all in the order chromatically as published for the chromatic steps, arising C major, C minor, etc., C sharp major, C sharp minor. But the structure, the proportions, the sense of how does he use what? Why does he take freedoms and why does he stay very much? You don't know always, but you try to feel like you can understand better. So since I wrote it as a child and I played still, I still have troubles playing them because you have to repractice them, rethink them, refinger them, reorganize their directions and voicing priorities. Which one more, which one less? At some point you cannot bring them all at the same time because then on the piano it becomes dreadfully thick. You think, and of course it's a three-voice fugue, it's not as thick as when you have another with the 4 or the 5 voices, but nevertheless it has to be always elegantly presented, cultivated, organized, and once you stick to a point of view that you've reached, either because you are told, either because some other people told you it's not supposed to be like this, and you're still trying to see what does it mean to me, how will I play it more convincingly for jury audition, exam, lesson, and you know, ultimately it's your choice. Of course, you have to exercise it with a lot of information, but never without your intuition. Never without your inner ear telling you what is beautiful, what is mournful, what is jubilant, what is fun, what is festive, what is majestic, because they do have their different characteristics for most of them. And if they don't have a very clear characteristic, let's D major 1, or even D major 2, some of them are just motoric, as they're supposed to be. G major 1, B flat major of the one that we saw earlier. But now we are reaching the moment of the sorrowful farewell almost at B flat minor. We are 2 from the end, B major and B minor. And I find that he has in mind perhaps that, perhaps not, in terms of the flow of the events through the 48 prelude and fugues, since they're studied individually, copied individually even in his time. But nevertheless, we have them in volumes. And so we can be curious and observe how does he treat the B-flat minor color of tonality timbre. What does it suggest? Something mournful, something lamenting. And those complex, sophisticated and beautiful chords with full of dissonances in minor, very, very distinguished. You also can bring a middle voice. Of the top. Appoggiatura, anticipation, appoggiatura. And all that on the ostinato of the B flat. advocate for arpeggiation on the piano per se, because it sounds like I'm trying to imitate the harpsichord. In a way, yes, because on the plucked instrument, many notes played together cancel each other, but on the hammer instrument, you can voice them, of course, you can play them equal, or, but then it becomes almost too smart for the sake of it. I think you need to always find the right tone where the music itself guides you on the tracks. It's so emotionally intense, these harmonic dissonances. It's like the last intermezzo, Opus 119 by Brahms. You have these moments of the thirds in dissonant, expressive, emotional appoggiaturas, and here it's the same. In Brahms, in this. Why do the thought comes to me? Because I try to not banalize the comparison, which after all has no point, since of course these two composers didn't live at the same time. Of course Brahms learned about Bach, and Bach couldn't learn about Brahms. Poor Bach. Would have been much different, but that's the way it is. And so we know all these. We have tasted these fruits, and we have discovered music from Renaissance onwards, or even before. And so, yes, we place it in a genre of the lament, with the ascending cacciatura or porte de voix, pleading compared to if it was. But it's the under appoggiatura. And if you arpeggiate, perhaps you can do the most expressive, crunchy, juicy, melodic and harmonizations to have a minor triad and a diminished dominant triad with a tonic together. Of course, played like that alone, it sounds like a collision, but played in the flow, the alto, soprano, tenor, second tenor, and the ostinato of the bass. Once you display them linear separately, then you hear them together differently. Not as a package at the get-go, but really. And it's difficult to play a slow tempo without to slow down. And that is important by counting and thinking the offbeats. 2, 4, 6, 8, 2. You play 1, 3, 5, 7 anyway of the eighth notes, but 2, 4, 6, 8 gives you the flow to the next step. It's almost like something of a ceremony, of a procession. This eighth note to 16th note, of which the first 16th note is the same repeated note, is the contrasubject of F minor of Book 1, or of the chromatic fantasy in fugue of the fugue. Can we play it less slow and still keep that emotional lament style? So you started here, in your eye, almost an octave above in the soprano. Then the bass picks up the theme. and each arrival point is a dissonance. So yes, I think it's possible to play less slow as long as you keep that pace of peaceful and at the same time emotional more than sad. And if you play it in a more slow tempo, I think that there are several truths to the tempo. Appoggiatura after repeated notes, 16th note is passing tones, and it's relatively purposely, most likely, obviously, for Bach's time, and by Bach himself, monotonous. Ta-da-dum, pum, ta-da-dum, pum, ta-da-dum, pum. There's no triplets, you don't have 16th notes like in D major. Or E minor fugue. He explores so many beautiful varieties of human music expression, song, finger agility, or finger singing. Yeah, I think that if you observe the second book's B-flat minor in this case, it's also mournful but with more flow. It's written in cut time, so it suggests it's not too slow, but it's mainly eighth notes. Ignore the cut time, half note to 2, and just play it in 4/4. With the descending patterns of the top and then the leap of the octave in half and whole notes, which is answered in an imitation by the alto. With the same ascending lament pattern on the book 1 20 years ago, 20 years ago when he wrote this. I'm silly. How far we are from the original idea that the prelude is just a harmonization of the intonation before the main dish is the fugue. Here you have such a complex, fertile, and incredibly subtle polyphony before the fugue. Some of the preludes are as polyphonic as their fugues by imitation and suspensions and appoggiaturas and all the other effects that bring us to have some kind of expression of the emotion that goes through this music, regardless if it's Baroque for us, but not for them at the time. It was modern. And so that's why I think that in some aspects Bach's music has not changed in terms of style through his life, because when you hear Book 1, the subject of the fugue, half notes, rest, and 16th notes. And guess what is the fugue's book 2? Half notes, rest, and quarter notes. You could almost play them together. That's silly, isn't it? But I think it's striking that he uses the palette of his lament colors of writing with chromaticisms, and also with step-by-step motion. And here, after the initial leap of the minor 9, everything else trickles down by step motion. So you have a striking and driven leap, and then the passing tones. And here you rise to the tritone, back to the tonic, and then you try with eighth notes, and got just one note more than the first, which was E, then into the G appoggiatura of F is here, the E flat appoggiatura of the D flat. And because you have eighth notes, which you didn't have in the beginning, I think that you can bring out the subtle suggestion of bringing out, without accent or overholding, the notes Si, Do, Re, Mi, Si, Do, Re, Mi, Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Re, Mi, Fa, Sa. The B, C, D, E in half notes and quarter notes, and then B, C, D, E in flow of eighth notes. That's a long subject, well, not as long as B minor book 1. But long enough to have a lot of interruptions, as if it's a fragmented subject. Delay, delay, then stretto, delay. So in a way, the sounds are interruptions of music, rests. The rest is music, and the notes are music, but the rests are music too. By interview of some pianists, I have read that they decided that sometimes those rests in the middle are not necessarily so important because you have the resonance of the sound. Well, obviously not here, but on a concert grand piano in an acoustic, so it wouldn't be such cut-off interruption, as striking as it is to the eye, unless you play shorter value to the C. You have this pregnant rest that is intense, as if you have and I think this is very meaningful, because if you can integrate the rests before and during the subject presentation, then of course you fragment it because it's written like that, but you connect it by the intensity of the bridge that the rest between the notes represents, as if it's not just a beginning, okay, okay. It's not harmonization, it's really melodic line and scale. So I can play it like this for you to hear what I think about the sounds almost dying into the rest, and the next sound is spawned from the rest. In the bridge also. If you do that, you can be very expressive, but because on one side the fugue is long, on the other side the fugue is a spreading of voices in their integrity and their layering over each other, or under each other obviously as well. I think that if you characterize less the different articulations of half notes into eighth notes, into rests of quarter notes, you can obtain something more even in the sense of timbre. It's the same instrument and the orchestra playing all the notes, and not bassoon, clarinet, strings, and conclusion with horns. Now it's not just like colorization of timbrization, if that exists as a word, but a single sound quality for eighth notes, quarter notes, half notes, and the rests. It's more severe, it's more austere, it's more focused, it's more reflective, it's more interiorized. Flow with brief interruptions, not to breathe artistically or instrumentally if I was a woodwind or a voice singer, but it's mostly about striking by the interruption what you just heard, and you're seized and you're attentive what will be the next. So respect those rests, not just because they're written also, but because you want to give them a meaning of, it's like almost the shape of the wind for centuries on rocks. And little by little it shapes them according to the wind. And that is something that is like here, it's a shaping the rests and the music. If he not, he could have written only notes. He won't do the augmented second, while he did it in A minor. Well, let's say the most important here is that the mood of the subject is intense, interrupted, and resilient, going step by step. And you feel this build-up of intensity by that step motion whenever in the subject of book 1 it's more flowing, since there is no interruption. Another of these few 5-voice fugues, like C sharp minor, book 1. He doesn't continuously play the 5 voices. They are very often 3 or 4, and with some punctuation moments of busyness for the accumulative expression, as well as, of course, the punctuation, he gets into 5. For instance, at the very end, when he goes... Picardy third to end in major, as he does for this one in book 2, when he has I think the minor key ones are often lament or driven fast chromatics, but chromatics are part of the Romantic era, and Bach already used them a lot. And he was fascinated by these chromatics. You have the diminished 7th chords, of course, Liszt, Chopin will use them so much even more. Bach uses them In fact, what he does is he depicts a soundscape which gives us room for our own way of expressing what we think is hinted. And how do we know, or how don't we know, is because we experiment with our own intuitive musicianship, even if we're told by a teacher, or we heard it by somebody else play, or we read an article about, or who knows how many recordings, to see how other people also hear, think, play, understand, or perhaps to our taste misunderstand how he doesn't know what he's doing. Okay, fine, all that is very essential to this endeavor of the comprehensive review of the elements that can bring us to define our, if not forever, at least for the time being, interpretation. It's sort of like something to do with conviction that you build up, if not at once intuitively, or at once or second time, through a lot of learned, studied, fingered, practiced, organized in the different ways that we can comprehend this complexity of the texture. We don't want to reduce it to the verticality of the chordal piano playing, reading, because of the display on two staffs. So, of course, it's more complex to write on the score the 5-voice fugue, because then you realize how little some voices speak, or how much others agglomerate, and it becomes a combination when we play them, or we have to tend to find ways to not allow this to happen, so that we can layer by shadows and lights, or with articulation differences. But generally, the more effects, the less austere, intense, and sometimes the beauty of it is in itself, and not in the way we over-display the expression that it brings us to feel through it. And in order to do that, we have to always go back to the basics, the metrics of the situation of the pulse, or also compared to the choice of the meter, and then the choice of the rhythmic values. Is it predominantly 8th notes, predominantly 16th notes, predominantly 30 seconds, or predominantly very whole notes and half notes? And this way, the subject of these slow, reflective fugues in tempo, I think, are more mysterious, intriguing, and compelling, and bringing us in an inner abyss of searching for the purpose of things through them. It's music that helps, besides trying to follow it in terms of the layout, is also reflective and self-insight thinking. It brings us to rethink who we are, what we are about. Playing it is one thing, obviously listening to it is another thing, but there is an active presence of the listener that is demanded as well. Trained or not as a musician, trained or not as a pianist, trained or not as a harpsichordist, just somebody who grows and shapes his or her culture around understanding of the stylistic definition and the genre. What is a fugue? What is a Baroque fugue? And how many types of fugues do we have? Vocal, instrumental, and what type of subjects and answers, and how does he organize his traveling through the sections with episode in circle of fifths, using head or tail of the subject to reconnect with this fertility of taking basic scale or repeated note or an arpeggio and making out of it a blossoming work of art that is spiritually uplifting, because it brings us to highest emotional intensity by the end when you play, compared to when you heard the opening in its loneliness, in its incredible vulnerability compared to the but I think that is the ultimate drive in the fugue, is to start with one, clone them around, and become so many of the one. So you don't have so much. Some have second and third subject, like C sharp minor, book 1, but most of them stick around with the subject, contra subject, and then all the rest is, of course, the answer is the echo of the dominant of the subject. But beyond that, what you hear is a unity of elements. Eighth notes everywhere, sixth note everywhere, and then some half notes and some rests and some quarter notes. But you observe it immediately when you see it. Of course, when you see, it's not what you hear. When you play, it's not what you translate from what you read. It's something that you don't bring out the rests as you should, but acoustics pedal, or also the bar lines, which are of course organized to fit in the group of beats evenly inside, if there are eighth notes, quarter notes, half notes, the value of. And so of course when you play that fugue, imagine if it was written, notated rather, without bar lines. You will just follow the flows of the overlapping phrases, sentences that have this eloquent aim towards which they're magnetically attracted.